I already jacked up my truck and removed the wheel, so let's start by disconnecting the ABS line. Start with an 8mm wrench like this one. I tried to use the closed end, but it was too tight and won't fit, so use the open end to start. Then you can use the closed end to speed up the process if you have a set of ratcheting wrenches like these. These come in handy, and I will link them down in the description below. Once that bolt is removed, you can grab a 10mm socket and get to work on the bolt that holds this bracket in place. Remove the bolt and then you should be able to pull the bracket out. Now grab your panel removal tool and use it on the 2 clips for your ABS line. Then we can move up to the fender liner and pull the connector out, just like that. Make sure you push the red locking tab out first before you try to disconnect it. Perfect. Then you want to push right here and pull the connectors apart. Next, you want to pull the wire away from everything so it won't be in your way as you are removing parts. This part just pulls right out. Now we can begin working on the brake caliper. So grab your 21mm socket and loosen the 2 caliper bracket bolts. Don't remove the top bolt all the way as you don't want the caliper to fall after you remove the bottom bolt. This could put too much stress on the brake hose, which can cause leaks. And you want to make sure it's the top bolt that is left in, because if you leave the bottom bolt in, the caliper will still swing from top to bottom. So leave the top bolt in until you are ready to remove the whole unit. Once the bottom bolt is completely removed, you can get ready to remove the top bolt. But there are 2 things you want to do first. You want to give the caliper a twist like this. This will help push the brake pads in just enough so it's easier to pull off the rotor, which will also help a ton when you're ready to put the caliper back on. The next thing you want to do is get your caliper S-hook or whatever you are using to secure the caliper ready. The caliper has some weight to it, so try to get as prepared as you can to make this easier on you. If you have an S-hook, it should fit perfectly into the frame hole right here. My strap hooks did not fit, so I had to find another location. It took me a minute to figure out the best spot since I wanted to make sure the caliper would be far enough out of my way to not interfere with the job, but also high enough to prevent any stress on the brake hose. You also want to make sure you mount it on something that won't bend or break. I first placed the hook right here thinking it was far enough out of the way. However, as you can see, the caliper hung relatively low and I was worried about that brake hose. So I had to find another location. You can't see it right now because of the camera angle, but I hooked it around the upper control arm and it worked great. I'll show you that later. Let's begin loosening those wheel bearing bolts. I highly recommend you spray these down with some penetrating fluid. If they are still giving you trouble, grab a breaker bar or a pipe like I have right here. This should give you enough leverage to break those bolts free. Go ahead and remove all 4 bolts and then we can move on. You may think you can start hitting the wheel bearing off at this point, however, do not do that. You still need to remove the axle nut. So grab your channel locks and start by removing this cap. You want to move around the cap while prying up and down or side to side. This will eventually free the cap and give you access to the axle nut. You can also use a flathead screwdriver and hit the end with a hammer as most people do. However, if you want to reuse your caps, this is a much better method as it won't damage the inside edge. And just like that, the cap pops right off. Now we can remove the axle nut. This is a 13mm bolt and I recommend using a deep socket like this so you don't hit the wheel studs while turning your wrench. Also, the wheel tends to turn with the axle nut as you are trying to loosen it. So I recommend hitting your wrench with the palm of your hand a few times in the counterclockwise direction. Eventually it will loosen to the point where you can unscrew it by hand and remove it. Once the nut is removed, you should be able to pull the wheel bearing off. If you can't, just hit it with a hammer or mallet. Let's remove the nut for the outer tie rod. This is a 21mm. Having an impact in this situation helps a ton. You will notice some resistance as the nut gets closer to coming off. Just keep turning. There we go. Alright, here comes the fun part. You need to separate the tie rod from the hub. So grab your penetrating fluid and try to spray around the bushing like this, and then spray upwards on the threads. Now let it set for a few minutes and then we can try to free it. Alright, so I'm going to try something that you should never do. I'm going to turn my truck on and turn the steering wheel from side to side in hopes of breaking the tie rod free. You can see right away how dangerous this is. Look how my truck rocks on the jack stand. I did not notice it while I was sitting in my truck, but after seeing the footage, I won't be doing that again. Of course, this part isn't in the camera's view, but you can see me hitting this part of the hub. This separated it perfectly. So I would advise you do that, and do not move the steering wheel back and forth while it's on jack stands unless the whole front end is lifted and in the air. This allows the hub assembly to move freely side to side, which is going to be beneficial if you need to remove the CV axle or the integrated wheel end, otherwise known as IWE. Now you just need to give it a couple of whacks and the tie rod is now completely free. Now you can apply thread locker to all 4 of your wheel bearing bolts. Doing this now helps prevent you from forgetting later. That looks good. Now let's apply our grease to the inside of the hub. You don't need a lot, just make sure you cover the surface the wheel bearing will slide into. And then add some to the wheel bearing itself. You need some around the teeth like this. And also, you need to apply some in the center like this. That looks great. Alright, now change your gloves to prevent grease from getting everywhere, and then slide the wheel bearing into the hub with the ABS line at the top. Now you can begin threading your first bolt to hold the bearing in place. Once that is hand tight, grab the next bolt and do the same thing. Before you get the bolts too tight, you want to move this ABS line up and out of the way. You need to feed it around and under the dust shield. You may need to pull on the shield a little bit to get the line under it. It's probably easier if you feed the line under it before you mount the wheel bearing, but this works too, eventually. Just make sure you push this plate back or else it will rub against your rotor while you are driving. Now screw in the remaining 2 bolts by hand. Then we can grab our 18mm socket and begin tightening these down. You want to do this in a crisscross pattern. So I went from top right to the bottom left, to the bottom right, and finish with the top left. This ensures the wheel bearing is flush with the hub. Now go back over each bolt one more time before torquing them down. These need to be torqued down to 129 foot-pounds, but as I stated earlier, my bigger torque wrench is not working. So I'm going to use my impact until my new one comes in. Let's move on to the axle nut. As you can see, there is red thread locker on these nuts already. Why is this important information, you may ask? Because for some reason, I added more thread locker to this one. I think the heat started to get to me. But you can see the red thread locker in the threads of the nut already. So this is completely unnecessary. Go ahead and screw the axle nut on by hand until it won't screw anymore. Then you can grab your 13mm deep socket and begin tightening it down. You want to use a deep socket to prevent from hitting those wheel studs. Then you can grab your torque wrench and tighten it down to 30 foot-pounds. Eventually the wheel bearing will start turning with the wrench, so grab a stud with one hand as you pull in your torque wrench with the other. Just like that. Now this part is completely unnecessary, but in order to prevent any kind of moisture from rusting out the parts inside, I decided to add some grease around the axle nut. I'm thinking this helps, however I could be completely wrong. So you do what you want with this. Now, you can install your cap. Make sure it's as straight as possible before hitting it with a hammer or a mallet. That looks good. I'm going to wipe off the rest of the grease and then we can move on. Alright, go ahead and screw a lug nut all the way on to keep the rotor from moving around while installing the caliper. Then grab your caliper and place it over the rotor. You may need to give the back of the caliper a few jabs, just make sure it's lined up perfectly. Now you can grab your bolt and hopefully you already put thread locker on it before mounting the caliper, like me. This looks easy because the caliper isn't moving around, but try to remember to add thread locker before grabbing the caliper so you can immediately start threading it in. These calipers have some weight to them. Go ahead and thread the bolt in as far as you can with your fingers and then you can torque them down to 184 foot-pounds using your 21mm socket. Perfect. Now you can grab your brake hose bracket and put it into the middle slot, just like that. Then you can grab the bigger of the 2 bolts remaining and add some thread locker to it. Finger tighten it. And then grab your 10mm socket and snug it down. That should be good. Next, grab your ABS line and put this part in the hook. This will keep the line in place as you get that 8mm bolt installed. I added some thread locker to this bolt as well, but it's probably not necessary. Go ahead and grab your 8mm socket and snug it down as well. Perfect. Now we can remove any bungees or straps we still have, and then grab our ABS line and first insert the tab into here. There is another tab you need to push in this area, and you may need to filter the wire around to make it work. Then you can insert the connector into one end and then press in the red tab. Once that's connected, go ahead and press those two white tabs back through the other side of the fender liner, just like that. Next, reattach your IWE vacuum line. This should just push right in, but make sure the larger hole and smaller hole line up with the male ends of the IWE. And then you can press the tab back into the bracket. My tab is broken, as you can see, but it still holds. Now you need to apply a thin coat of anti-seize to the face of the rotor, being careful not to get any on the surface that the brake pads come in contact with. All that's left is to get your wheel back on and torque down the lug nuts to 125 foot-pounds.
That's all there is to it. If you found any part of this video helpful or entertaining, please give it a thumbs up. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button as well as the notification bell so you don't miss a video from our channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.